All right, it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm happy to kind of start the day off with to share some information and some research results for a project that's been kind of ongoing for the last 2 years. A team that I work with, along with Peter Smith and Iggy at the Institute for Work and Health, we've done this research project with in partnership with a number of settlement agencies here in Southern Ontario. So just before we begin, this research was funded in part through the Ontario Ministry of Labour Research Opportunities Program, as well as with funding from the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. I've got about 20 minutes to walk you through kind of 4 stages, a little bit of a background on the occupational health and safety vulnerability measure that the Institute for Work and Health has been developing over the better part of the last 4 or 5 years. I'll share a few details about the immigrant-specific study that we've done, or kind of show you some of the results that we found, and conclude with a few thoughts, which hopefully will dovetail nicely into the presentation from Vashak and Iggy. So where this begins is with a conversation about what it means to be vulnerable in the workplace. What does occupational health and safety vulnerability mean? And typically, we've used demographic and occupational characteristics to define who is vulnerable. So under this umbrella of vulnerable workers, we often see workers in small business, workers in high-risk industries like construction, young workers, new workers, and immigrant workers. The challenge with taking this approach is, in fact, there are a number of challenges. One is that it makes it sound as though these groups and these individuals are inherently at risk, that it's a result of their population characteristics or their job that they are at risk. The second disadvantage of taking this approach is that it focuses on individuals, the worker themselves, rather than the context that they're working in, which provides very few levers for policy or regulatory and organizational level changes to better protect workers. And another disadvantage of taking this approach is it lumps a whole lot of people who are very different under the umbrella of vulnerable, rather than looking specifically at why they might be vulnerable. So at the Institute, we've begun reframing what it means to be a vulnerable worker. And instead, we focused on 4 dimensions of workplace circumstance to understand who is vulnerable and who is most at risk of injury or illness in the workplace. The 4 dimensions that we focused are the level of hazards a worker experiences, and then 3 strategies that might be used to mitigate the impact of those hazards. The first being workplace policies and procedures that protect workers. The second being the workers' awareness of their hazards, but also their rights and responsibilities in the workplace. And that 4th dimension we focused on is worker empowerment, to speak up in the job and to participate in injury prevention in their day-to-day experiences at work. And we came to these 4 dimensions following a literature review and a number of stakeholder consultations that took place over 18 months. Each of these 4 dimensions is measured using a number of questions. So in total, we asked workers 27 questions to measure their vulnerability in the workplace. We asked them 9 questions about the kinds of hazards they experience in the workplace. So we asked them about whether they work at heights, whether they're exposed to hazardous materials or chemicals in their day-to-day jobs, or, for example, whether they experience bullying or harassment in the workplace. We asked 7 questions about the policies and procedures that protect them in the workplace. So, for example, is safety considered just as important as production and quality in your workplace? Or is there an active health and safety committee in place to protect you? We ask workers 6 questions about whether they're aware of their rights and responsibilities in the workplace, or whether they're aware of their employer's rights and responsibilities in the workplace. And finally, we ask 5 questions about empowerment. For example, we ask whether they know that whether they feel as though they can stop work if they feel as though something is unsafe, and whether they feel they'll face retribution in the workplace. We also ask questions like, do you have enough time to do your job safely? Using the responses to these 27 questions, we're able to categorize workers in a number of ways. First of all, we can determine whether they're exposed or not exposed to hazards in the workplace. And second, we determine whether they have inadequate or adequate access to those three remaining mitigation elements. So are they in a workplace where they have adequate policies and procedures in place? Are they, when in their workplace, do they have adequate awareness or adequate empowerment? And using these two dimensions, exposure to hazards and protections, we identify the most vulnerable workers. And those are workers who are exposed to hazards on a day-to-day basis in their workplace and don't have the protections in place to mitigate the effects of those hazards. And because we've measured three different kinds of protections, policies, procedures, and awareness, we're able to identify three specific and one overall measure of vulnerability. So we can identify who has policies and procedure vulnerability, who has awareness vulnerability, and who has empowerment vulnerability, which in some cases may overlap. Someone may indeed interact with each one of those types of vulnerabilities, but sometimes it's one specific vulnerability. So by teasing apart these different aspects, we're better able to identify the source of vulnerability and ideally solutions that might better address it. And then, of course, we have one overall measure of vulnerability, which would be individuals who are exposed to hazards at work, and lack one or more of those three protections. So over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, we've had the opportunity to use this measure to measure occupational health and safety vulnerability across the labour market in Ontario and in British Columbia. But in those studies, we noticed that we hadn't actually captured very many new immigrants. We hadn't really measured their occupational health and safety vulnerability. And as a result, we undertook a smaller study here in Toronto and a little bit further out in the fall of 2015 to better measure what occupational health and safety vulnerability looked like among recent newcomers. We worked with 4 settlement agencies who we have existing partnerships with, and we worked to train research assistants in those organizations who then recruited participants for our study. The study consisted of a questionnaire that included the 27 questions I mentioned earlier about occupational health and safety vulnerability, as well as a number of questions about demographics, the type of work people did, and whether they had experienced certain things in the course of their work. That survey was administered both in English and Spanish. We recruited workers who were over 15 years old, who were working in Canada or had Canadian work experience in the previous 12 months. As we'll see later on, not everyone we spoke to was currently employed, which may in fact be what had led them to the settlement agency, but everyone had and could speak to work experience in Canada in the previous 12 months. And at first we were looking for people who had been in Canada for 5 or fewer years. Later in the study we relaxed that criteria to include people who had been here for 10 years or less, just to improve our recruitment a little bit. So who did we speak to over the course of these 2.5 or 3 months? We spoke to a total of 195 individuals, and by we I mean our research assistants at these 4 sites recruited nearly 200 participants. 21 of those surveys were completed in Spanish, the rest in English. 60% of the individuals we spoke to were women, and nearly half were under 35, so a fairly young cohort of participants. 3/4 of them had been in Canada for fewer than 5 years. And just under 60% reported a bachelor's or a postgraduate degree, which I think probably speaks to a little bit about what Yogendra was describing earlier. This was a fairly highly educated and highly qualified group of individuals we spoke with. The vast majority described their spoken English as that they spoke English well or very well. What kind of work did these people do? Well, 71% were employed in full or part-time work. The remainder had worked in the last 12 months, as I described. 11 reported working at more than one job. So we focused their attention on the job that they worked the most hours at. That's the job that they were reflecting on when answering questions about their workplace experiences. More than half worked in small businesses, so in businesses that had 20 or fewer employees. And many worked in, and probably unsurprisingly, in the sales and service sector and in jobs in education and social service. So those jobs, those education and social service jobs were often personal support workers or in childcare. Only 10% reported being members of a union, and half were in temporary work relationships, which differs to our Ontario sample, where only about 10% were in temporary work relationships. We also asked the participants a series of questions about their workplace situation. So just under 9% noted that their employer had failed to pay their wages at some point in the previous 12 months. Nearly 1 in 5 reported that they didn't have a regular payday, and these are basic employment standards in Ontario. 16% mentioned that they often or always work more than 5 hours without a meal break. And only 30% described the work they do in Canada as similar to what they did in their home country. So now I'll share a little bit about what we learned about their occupational health and safety vulnerability. But just to remind you, we were looking at 4 different dimensions of vulnerability: workplace hazard exposure, the policies and procedures in place to protect workers, their awareness of their rights and responsibilities, and their empowerment to prevent injury in their workplace. From the survey results, we found that 2/3 of the immigrants we spoke to reported hazard exposure on a regular basis in their work. 44% or nearly 45% described inadequate policies and procedures. So the structures in place and policies in place in their workplace didn't meet the standard that we set that we thought to be adequate. 20% described having inadequate awareness about their rights and responsibilities, and 40% indicated that they didn't have adequate or felt disempowered in the workplace. At the same time as we did this study in the immigrant population, we also surveyed across the Ontario labour market about approximately 1,000 individuals. And we administered the same questionnaire there. So in the light blue bars, you can see the results from that questionnaire. So we see that immigrants and refugee sample that we spoke with had a statistically higher hazard exposure than the Canadian-born workers in Ontario that we spoke with. The immigrant population also had higher policies and procedure inadequacy and higher inadequate empowerment than that population, though at this point it wasn't statistically significant. And interestingly, immigrants and refugees reported lower inadequate awareness than larger Canadian-born Ontario worker sample that we spoke with. Having looked, so here we have each one of the 4 dimensions that we measured. And just to remind you, we took 2 of those dimensions together to identify who was most vulnerable. So individuals who were exposed to hazards and had an inadequate any one of those 3 protections we defined as vulnerable. And we compared the immigrant and refugee population that we spoke to that larger Canadian-born Ontario worker sample that we surveyed at the same time. And overall, we found that immigrant workers were 1.5 times more likely to experience overall occupational health and safety vulnerability. So that's what this number here represents. In the red box, anything up there indicates that immigrant workers are more at risk than the population that we compared them to. And these bars here just indicate how confident we are in our estimate. So when they cross the 1 here, we're a little bit less confident in our finding. But overall, we found that immigrant workers were 1.5 times as likely as Ontario or Canadian-born workers in Ontario to experience any type of vulnerability. Here's what it looks like when we examine each dimension of vulnerability or each type of vulnerability separately. So we still have a significant overall vulnerability finding, but we also find that policies and procedure vulnerability is higher among immigrant workers than it is among the Canadian-born Ontario population. And you'll also see that both the empowerment and awareness type of vulnerability are higher in the immigrant population than they are in the Ontario population, or the Canadian-born population in Ontario, though we're slightly less confident about our findings there. But for example, this empowerment indicates that immigrant workers are 34% more likely to have empowerment vulnerability as their counterparts that are born in Canada. We then did one final thing, which is to adjust for the population characteristics of who we spoke to and the types of work that we were in. So we took into account the fact that more people in the immigrant population were in temporary work than the Canadian-born Ontario population, and we also took into account the age and gender and education demographics. And when we take that into account, we see a few changes. Overall, immigrants remain at a greater risk of overall empowerment. But after taking into account those workplace characteristics in particular, we see that empowerment, vulnerability, stands out as an important driver of overall vulnerability among immigrants. So after the adjustment, immigrant workers are more than 1.5 times as likely as Canadian-born Ontario workers to experience empowerment vulnerability. So that's the type of vulnerability that arises from not feeling as though you can speak up at work, not feeling as though you're in a position to be actively engaged in protecting yourself and your colleagues in the workplace. The other two types of vulnerability remain elevated among immigrants, though we're slightly less confident now about the magnitude of those findings. So I'll just finish with a couple of conclusions about what we found in this study. Overall, we found that new immigrants are more often exposed to hazards in the workplace than Canadian-born workers in Ontario, and that 45% of the newcomer workers we spoke to experienced some type of vulnerability in their workplace. Low empowerment, as I noted here, is an important driver of occupational health and safety vulnerability among the immigrants that we spoke to. And I think an important thing to note would be that we spoke to just those immigrant workers who were connected with settlement agencies and who had fairly sophisticated English language skills. So there's a good possibility we missed a large segment of the immigrant population who may indeed experience greater vulnerability or increased precarity in their day-to-day working lives. And I think overall, this work, alongside some of the larger work we've been doing on occupational health and safety vulnerability, we found that it's important to understand the dual drivers of vulnerability in the workplace. It's a combination of both exposure to hazards and a lack of access to protections, rather than focusing on individual characteristics. By focusing on these two dimensions that together place workers at greater risk, we have a better opportunity of identifying specific and relevant policy and regulatory and program drivers to address the specific types of vulnerability that different groups of workers are experiencing. So with that, I'm happy to answer some questions.